The sun had just risen over Oid Park, casting a soft, golden light through the trees. Its rays gently touched the paved jogging path that wove its way through the upscale, serene neighborhood, almost as if the world itself was waking up to greet the new day. Birds chirped a cheerful melody, their songs blending perfectly with the fresh, dew-laden air that filled the morning. To Selina Grant, this was more than just the start of a day. It was her moment of peace. Selina had always cherished these early hours, the stillness, the clarity it brought her. Dressed in a sleek, black athletic outfit with her wireless earbuds securely in place, she jogged at a steady, rhythmic pace. Her breath was calm, and her mind was free from the noise that the day would surely bring. As the head of internal affairs for the state police, Selina's life was anything but ordinary. At 38, she had climbed to one of the highest positions in law enforcement, her reputation built on her relentless commitment to rooting out corruption and holding her colleagues accountable. It was a job that earned her respect, but also made her many enemies. Every day, she faced new challenges, balancing justice, reform, and navigating the complex world of law enforcement. Selina had recently moved to the upscale Oak Park neighborhood, not to flaunt her success, but to escape the hustle of city life and find peace. She didn't need the lavish surroundings. She needed the tranquility they offered. The community was quiet, the perfect place for reflection. It was where she could focus on what mattered most: her work, her values, and her mission for change. With the gentle hum of a podcast about police reform playing in her ears, Selina's steps were in perfect sync with the rhythm of her thoughts. She didn't just jog, she reflected, her mind running through the pressing issues of the day, finding clarity amidst the stillness. That is, until the sound of an engine broke her concentration. A police cruiser slowly rolled up alongside her, its presence a jarring interruption to her peaceful routine. Inside the car, Officer Thomas Hale's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he eyed Selina from behind dark sunglasses. He didn't like what he saw: a black woman jogging in his predominantly white neighborhood. His instincts kicked in, and his mind began to fill in the blanks. The narrative he spun in his head didn't match reality, but that didn't matter. In his eyes, she didn't belong here. He'd worked the Oak beat for years and had always seen himself as the gatekeeper, the protector of the neighborhood's order. Raised by a father who had been a high-ranking officer, Thomas had grown up with a deep sense of duty, but also a sense of superiority. Authority wasn't just a responsibility, it was a tool to maintain power, or at least, his version of it. The lines of his upbringing were clear. Some people simply didn't belong in certain spaces. As he watched Selina jog, his prejudice twisted his perception, and he convinced himself that she must be up to something. Without any evidence, he decided to investigate, thinking he had the right to stop her. He flicked on his sirens and brought the cruiser to a halt ahead of her. Selina's jog slowed as she approached the police cruiser blocking her path. Raising an eyebrow, she gave the vehicle a quick, puzzled glance, her expression cool but clearly irritated. She pulled one earbud from her ear as she stopped, already knowing what was about to unfold. It wasn't the first time she had been unfairly stopped by law enforcement, but each time, it felt like another blow to her sense of justice. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his face stern and unwelcoming. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture exuding authority, but there was something about his demeanor that made it clear he was looking for a confrontation. "Hey, you!" he barked, pointing at Selina. "What are you doing here?" Selina's brow furrowed in confusion at the hostility in his tone. She gestured toward her athletic clothes, her water bottle strapped to her waist. "I'm jogging," she replied calmly, her voice steady and unruffled. But Thomas wasn't satisfied. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, narrowing his eyes. "We got a report about a suspicious person matching your description. Trespassing, possibly involved in theft. Care to explain yourself?" Selina blinked, taken aback by the accusation. She hadn't expected this kind of response. "Excuse me," she said, her patience already beginning to wear thin. "I live around here. I jog this path every morning." Thomas didn't listen. He folded his arms and looked her up and down with suspicion, his eyes scanning for something to validate his assumptions. "You got any ID on you?" he demanded. Selina sighed. already sensing where this was headed. "I left it at home," she replied, her tone firm but not hostile. "I wasn't expecting to need it for a run." Thomas smirked as if he'd just caught her in a lie. "Convenient. So no proof you live here? No ID? You know what that looks like, right?" By now, a small crowd of onlookers had begun to gather at a safe distance, whispering amongst themselves and recording the encounter on their phones. Selena glanced at them, realizing this was quickly turning into something more. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with authority. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. I live 2 blocks from here. This is a misunderstanding." Thomas stepped closer, his frustration rising. "Misunderstanding? Look, lady, I don't have time for games. Either you cooperate, or we're going to have a problem." Selena's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also knew her rights. "Officer," she said quietly, "I'm going to ask you to think carefully about what you're doing. You're making a mistake." Thomas, fueled by his own arrogance, misinterpreted her calm warning as defiance. His anger flared. "Oh, is that a threat? You think you can intimidate me?" he sneered. Before she could respond, he reached for his handcuffs, his movements sharp and aggressive. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Selena didn't move. Her voice dropped lower, but it was steady, calm, and unwavering. "Officer, I'm telling you, back off. You have no idea who I am." To Thomas, her composure only intensified his anger. He grabbed her arm, attempting to twist it behind her back, but Selena moved with surprising agility, slipping from his grip like water. The onlookers gasped, their phones capturing the moment, and for a split second, Thomas froze. "Resisting arrest," he shouted, reaching for his radio. Selena didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, her expression resolute. "No, officer," she said, her voice cold and firm. "That's me reminding you that you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." Thomas, his face twisted in frustration, wasn't ready to back down. His pride was bruised, and his ego wouldn't let him admit he'd made a mistake. He yanked out his handcuffs with a sense of finality and snapped them onto Selena's wrists, securing them with a roughness that made several onlookers flinch. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, and a young man raised his voice. "What's wrong with you, man? She didn't even do anything," he shouted, his phone still recording. "Yeah, let her go," an older woman added, clutching the leash of her dog in one hand while holding her phone in the other. Selena's gaze swept over the gathering crowd, their phones trained on Thomas and her as if they were witnessing something more than just an arrest. She knew this scene would go viral in moments. Her calm expression remained unbroken. She wasn't just a jogger anymore. She was a symbol of something much larger than herself. Thomas barked at the onlookers, his voice rising with a hint of panic as the weight of their judgment began to bear down on him. "Step back," he shouted, his hand trembling as he tried to maintain control of the situation. "This is a police matter. Clear the area." But his orders fell on deaf ears. The crowd stood firm, voices escalating with each passing second. Selena, still composed, didn't react to his attempts at intimidation. Instead, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on him, challenging him without uttering a word. She could feel the heat of the onlookers' judgment, but she didn't care. She knew this moment would expose him for who he truly was. As Thomas shoved her toward the back of the patrol car, his frustration simmered. He wasn't used to being defied, and the fact that Selena wasn't breaking under pressure only made him angrier. "You're making a scene," he spat, as he opened the car door and pushed her inside. Selena stepped into the car with a quiet grace that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to escalate things further. Her expression, however, told a different story. A story that was about to unfold in ways Thomas couldn't imagine. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, her eyes sharp and knowing. "I warned you," she said softly, her words laced with an unspoken promise. "You'll regret this by the end of the day." The words hung in the air as the patrol car pulled away, leaving behind a crowd still shouting and recording. In the back seat, Selena leaned back, her calm demeanor betraying nothing of the storm that was about to hit. She knew her rights, and she knew that the truth would come to light far sooner than Thomas could ever expect. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the events play out in her mind, but knowing it wasn't over yet. Back at the station, Thomas walked through the double doors with an air of reluctant victory. He felt the eyes of the Oak Park community still watching him, their judgment lingering like a shadow. But he brushed it off. He had done his job, at least in his mind. It was time to process the suspect and move on. He couldn't have known who she was, and in his mind, that justified everything. "I've got one for trespassing and resisting arrest," Thomas announced as he slapped the paperwork onto the counter with a loud thud. She got a little feisty back there. His tone carried a sense of smug satisfaction, as if he had just completed a job well done. Selena raised an eyebrow at his description but didn't engage. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to speak. She knew exactly what was coming. The truth was on its way, and no amount of arrogance could stop it. Thomas's victory was hollow, and he had no idea how badly he had just overplayed his hand. Before Thomas could say another word, the door to the station burst open with a force that silenced the room. Captain Marina Blackwood strode in, her presence commanding and authoritative. Her sharp features and no-nonsense demeanor made it clear that she was not someone to be trifled with. In one hand, she held a tablet, and in the other, a printout of something that made Thomas's stomach drop. "Thomas Hale," she called out, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "What in the world have you done?" Thomas froze, his smirk quickly fading as the weight of the situation began to settle in. He turned to face her, his mind racing, but all he could manage was a stammer. Captain Blackwood," he began, his voice uncertain. "Save it," Marina snapped, cutting him off with a glare that left no room for excuses. She slammed the tablet onto the counter, its screen displaying live footage of the arrest. The video had gone viral, and it was now a public spectacle, one that was showing Thomas in the worst possible light. It was a grainy, shaky video, but it was clear enough to capture his aggressive behavior and the crowd's protest. The bystanders' voices rang out, condemning his actions as they witnessed the injustice unfold. Marina read from the paperwork Thomas had filed, her voice dripping with disbelief and anger. "Trespassing? Resisting arrest? Feisty," she quoted, her disbelief growing with every word. "Do you even know who this is?" Thomas blinked, completely caught off guard. He glanced nervously at Selena, who stood calmly with a faint smile, and opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "She's Selena Grant," Marina interrupted, her tone sharp, "head of internal affairs for the state police department. Your boss's boss." Thomas's face drained of color. His mouth went dry as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He had no idea who he had just accosted, and now, the entire department, and the world, knew about it. His smug confidence crumbled like a house of cards. Marina shot him a cold glare. "You've just humiliated yourself, this station, and the entire department," she said, her voice filled with scorn. "You've made every mistake possible in one encounter." Selena, still composed, stepped forward. Her calm voice broke the heavy silence. "I told you you'd regret this by the end of the day," she said, her words cutting deep. Marina's eyes softened as she turned to Selena. "We'll handle this," she said with resolve. "Rest assured, Officer Hale will face the consequences." With a swift motion, Marina pulled the badge from Thomas's chest, the sound of the metal clinking against the counter echoing through the room. "You're officially stripped of your badge and authority, effective immediately," she said firmly. "Consider yourself suspended without pay, pending further charges." The room fell silent. Thomas stood frozen, the realization of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The career he had worked so hard to build was crumbling in front of him. Selena turned to face him, her expression unflinching. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said softly, but her words carried the weight of truth. "You only needed to treat me with the respect and fairness every citizen deserves." As the video of the arrest continued to spread across social media, it quickly reached national news outlets. Headlines flashed across screens, calling out the incident as a glaring example of racial profiling gone wrong. The public outrage was swift and loud, and calls for reform echoed in every corner of the country. Later that day, Selina stood outside the station, her posture tall and dignified, Captain Blackwood by her side. Cameras flashed, and the crowd of reporters hung on her every word. "This isn't just about one bad officer," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about a culture that allows this behavior to go unchecked. And that ends today. We will hold every officer accountable. Starting here." The crowd cheered, their faith in change momentarily restored, as Selina's message of justice resonated deeply with those who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. Months later, the ripple effects of the encounter were still unfolding. Thanks to Selina's leadership, a sweeping investigation into the local police force uncovered deeper issues of misconduct and abuse of power. Several officers faced disciplinary action, and reforms were implemented to prevent further injustices. Selina's name became synonymous with justice, her calm strength and unwavering resolve inspiring a movement that pushed for real change. Thomas's life, however, took a drastically different turn. Convicted of misconduct and stripped of his certification, he struggled to find work. With no badge and a tarnished reputation, he was forced to take a job as a parking lot attendant. His pride shattered, he spent his days handing out tickets, the weight of his actions following him like a shadow. One afternoon, as Thomas worked under the blazing sun, he noticed a TV playing inside a nearby diner. Through the window, he saw Selina standing at a podium, receiving a prestigious national award for her contributions to police reform. The audience applauded as Selina smiled graciously, her success a sharp contrast to his own fall from grace. Thomas froze, the memory of that day in Oak Park flooding back. Her calm warnings, the protests from the onlookers, and the reality of his own hubris played in an endless loop in his mind. The consequences of his actions had not just cost him his career. It had reshaped his entire life.